All right, so the next area we're going to start taking a look at now is going to be the circulatory system. And in all honesty, with the circulatory system, it is such a depth system, such a high level of stuff to know on this one that we kind of break it up into really three different sections. We're going to talk about really the blood first, then the heart, and then finally the vessels and what's going on with that, and a lot of the regulation involved with each of these. Uh, so again, really quite a deep system. Overall, though, I want to take a look at the circulatory system first, and then we will start talking about the blood and some of the different components of it. So overall, let's take a look at the circulatory system. Circulatory system is really the combination of these three things, of which we're doing each one as its own little separate section. You're going to have the blood, which is the circulating material. You have the heart, which is going to be pumping that material around the blood. And then you have the vessels, which is the piping basically for this to go through. I always kind of use the analogy of the circulatory system and a house plumbing system in terms of water pressure versus blood pressure. There's a lot of similarities in all actuality. Not surprisingly, considering water is the main component that makes up blood, so something that would influence water pressure, not surprisingly, influences blood pressure. So our circulatory system is a two-circuit system. You have a pulmonary circuit, as you can see in the upper part of this right here, that is taking oxygen deficient blood and taking it to the lungs to pick up oxygen and bring it back to the heart. The heart can then pump that out to the rest of the body, which is the systemic circuit, that oxygen-rich material, which can deliver it to the tissues, which will use that oxygen to generate carbon dioxide, and that is then going to go back to the heart. And again, we're going to continue this circuit. So that is really what we're looking at when we start talking about the circulatory system. But even before that, we could kind of get into why do we need a circulatory system in general? So why do we need a circulatory system? And then after we get to that, we'll get into what does blood consist of, how does the body prevent blood loss, and then what are some of the blood types and why are they important to us? So why do we need a cardiovascular system? In reality, they figure we have about 38 trillion cells in our body. But really, when they start looking at evolution, we think life started out as single-celled organisms in the ocean. So life started out in the ocean. So it had a material always surrounding the cell, and anything that the cell might need or needs to get rid of, it had this medium surrounding it, so nutrients were surrounding the cell, and the cell could then send its waste back out. As we start getting more and more cells, again, those nutrients need to get into all these cells. So even if it's a small group of cells, we can still diffuse through these areas to get to these innermost cells. As organisms started to becoming more and more multicellular, and if you want to start thinking about kind of some of the simplest types of multicellular organisms, you could start talking about sponges. And sponges were basically kind of like a circulatory system, which is basically holes. So all these cells were closer to openings so this could start working through. And as we get more and more complex, we start seeing that these cells are in groups, and we need to get nutrients and be able to remove waste products from these cells if they are in these own little groups by themselves. This is why that circulatory system started coming in. Our cells started to become stationary. Because of that, we had to deliver the nutrients to the area surrounding the cell, as well as pick up the waste and remove them from the area surrounding the cell. So we needed to get that internal environment of the body, the area surrounding the cells, that interstitium, to have what these cells need to survive. So we needed to start delivering nutrients and removing waste products from this area in order for these cells to keep functioning correctly. So that is why, as we get into this a lot further, one of the things we'll see at the end here is, I'll show you some stuff here, is kind of what's in the blood. And you'll see I can go through and show you some lists of how many nutrients there are, what waste products, levels of these different hormones and other stuff like that. If you've ever went to the hospital and had to get blood tests done, the list that they give you that shows you all the different blood tests they can do, it's crazy. But the simple answer as to what is in the blood is really anything that needs to get in or out of a cell, we're going to find at some level in the bloodstream, because that is the only way for anything that needs to get into the cell to arrive at the cell, and anything that needs to get out of a cell to get away from the cell so it doesn't end up diffusing back in at some point. So that is why we need this circulatory system, because we have all these nutrients, this temperature, these hormone levels, everything else that needs to be at these certain levels to function for the cell correctly. And because our cells can't move, we have to deliver that to the area surrounding these cells, so the cells can then take up what they need to from that surrounding fluid. So what is the primary functions of the circulatory system? Not surprisingly, it's transporting. It is really a way to deliver nutrients, remove waste products, move heat around the body, as well as send a lot of signals through that blood to these different tissues, to those target cells. So it is a transport mechanism. The other thing that the blood does is it is protective. One of the subsets of the formed elements we're going to talk about are the leukocytes. The leukocytes in general are cells that are going to evolve as part of the immune system. So they're really there to help deal with anything that might get into and try to become an issue for the body. So microorganisms, cancerous cells, the immune system is involved with that. And again, white blood cells, which are part of the blood, are the main components of that immune system. All right, so let's take a look overall at the blood. So we're going to kind of talk about how blood is composed of a couple of different things. So again, what does it consist of? Well, if we were to take blood, take a little bit of blood, put it into a little tube and spin it down, we can see that it is really divided into two main components. If you spin it down fast enough, you're going to get the liquid portion of the blood called the plasma, which is about 55% of it. And then the other 45-ish% is going to be the formed elements, which are a combination of erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, leukocytes, which are white blood cells, and platelets, also sometimes known as thrombocytes. But those are your different formed elements. That's the other 45%. So when you do this down, the erythrocytes are going to go to the bottom here because they are a little bit heavier. That is the vast majority of that sample, 44 to 45% of that sample on average. It can be a little bit more, it can be a little bit less, depending upon a number of different things. There is this really kind of light colored layer in between that and the straw colored plasma on top, which is called the buffy coat. This contains all those leukocytes and platelets in that little line in the center here. And then at the top of this tube, you're going to have the liquid portion of the blood, which is the plasma, which is going to have a number of dissolved substances and proteins within it. So again, we can look at both the plasma and the formed elements. To me, we're going to start out with just talking about some overall characteristics of blood. We will then take a little bit of a look at the plasma, then we'll start working our way through the different formed elements. So overall, if we start looking at the kind of the overall properties of blood and the amounts of it, we're going to see a few things. It's about 4 to 6 liters on average in the adult human body. Women, because they are a little bit smaller, tend to be on the lower end of this scale. Males, being a little bit bigger, tend to be on the higher end of the scale, but about 4 to 6 liters. So if we're talking about gallons, that's about a gallon to a gallon and a half of blood that is present in the body. Not that it's a big deal. It's about 8% of your body weight. And the temperature of this is slightly higher than what we would call body temperature because it is moving that heat around. It's about 38 degrees Celsius. In general, most tissues that are about 37. The pH of this is tightly regulated. It's a slightly alkaline one. So the pH is about 7.35 to 7.45. Anything that's getting out of those ranges pretty quickly can become really bad for the body. So we can talk about some issues with that. So acidosis versus alkalosis. In terms of how thick is the blood, well, the saying blood is thicker than water is true. It's about 4.5 to 5.5 times thicker than water due to dissolved substances as well as the cells that are within it. So whole blood is about 5 times thicker than water. The plasma, due to its dissolved substances within it, which is the more liquid portion of the blood, is still about twice as thick as water. So therefore it takes a little bit more pressure to push this stuff through there. It does have a slight saltiness to it, so there is a little bit of an osmolarity to it. And the salinity is about that 0.85%, which if you ever go to the hospital and you get an IV, they are generally giving you sterile saline, which is about 0.85%, an isotonic solution that is similar in salinity to your actual blood. if we look at blood, it is mainly red in color. We can see some slight differences in the coloring of it based on if it's oxygenated or not. Oxygenated blood tends to be a little bit brighter red, where oxygen poor blood tends to be a little bit darker red, which sometimes when you look at it through the skin can look a little bit more blue. That being said, there is not, like the books show, veins are not carrying blue blood and arteries are not carrying red blood. They are both carrying red blood. Like I said, slight differences in that depending on how much oxygen is bound to it, which is also part of the reason we can put the pulse oximeter on here, have it shine a particular red light, and depending on how it's reflected back, we can make some calls about how oxygenated that blood is. Like I said, it's about 5 liters in the adult, more thick than water. Again, really depends on what's in there. If we had more than normal erythrocytes or less than normal, that would be things that would affect the viscosity of the blood. And we're going to see when it gets to blood pressure, viscosity of the blood is one of these things that can influence the blood pressure. Again, not something that we really regulate blood pressure with, but it definitely can influence what that pressure is going to be. How high level something is in that plasma, a lot of times it's going to determine if it moves into the bloodstream or out of the bloodstream, or into cells or out of the cells. And generally we see the blood is about a degree warmer than the tissues that it's surrounding it, and that is part of the way that the body actually warms those tissues. Again, a slightly alkaline pH, 7.35 to 7.45. Anything that gets too far out of that is definitely going to start to become a major issue for the body. If we start getting close to 7.6 or 7.2, those areas start becoming very dangerous to any individual. A lot of times when we spin this down, we can also talk about what is called the Hemocrit. That is that percentage of your whole blood that is red blood cells. On average, that is about 45%. Again, males tend to be slightly around that range to slightly higher. Females tend to be from slightly beneath it to just over that range. Again, it has a lot to do with during the reproductive years in the female, they are going to lose to their monthly cycle, lose some blood every month, and because of that, they tend to have slightly lower Hemocrit levels, slightly lower hemoglobin levels, slightly lower red blood cell counts due to losing some of that blood every month. And again, you can see with the hemoglobin here, slightly lower in terms of hemoglobin levels in the female versus the male. Red blood cell counts, it's about 4 to 6 million red blood cells per microliter. Again, males tend to be on this higher end of that range, females on the lower end of that. And then if we start looking at per microliter, it's about, they usually say about 100 to 400,000 platelets per microliter, and about 4 to 11,000 white blood cells per microliter, 5 to 10,000 depending on the book that you look at. So what we're going to kind of finish off here with is talk a little bit about the plasma and what makes it up. Again, the plasma is going to be mostly water. So about 90+% of the plasma is water. We're going to see that there's then 3 main proteins that make up the main components of plasma. So you have something called albumin. Albumins made by the liver. These are plasma proteins, help maintain blood volume, as we'll see when we get to capillary exchange of water. But albumins help maintain that plasma volume. Globulins, there's a few different types, but one of the main types is gamma globulin, which is your antibodies. So part of that immune system. And then the other thing we're going to see, and we'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this chapter, is going to be fibrinogen, which is that clotting protein that becomes fibrin and it gets involved in stopping blood loss. Outside of that, we're going to see a lot of different trace proteins in there. Again, nothing that I'm going to point out in detail. And then we can start looking at other things that are in here. There's going to be nutrients, things like glucose, amino acids, some leftovers of muscle contraction like lactic acid. This is again kind of talking a bit about those plasma proteins. Like I said, albumins help maintain the blood volume. These are all made by the liver. This is also part of the reason if you start having liver failure, you will have issues with edema and too much water leaving the tissues, issues with clotting because a large number of these clotting proteins, globulins, albumins are made by that liver. And again, a lot of these proteins in there, especially those albumins, are too large to get moved out of the capillaries. So what they do is they create an osmotic gradient to draw water back in. And like I said, liver disease where you're not making enough of these tends to lead to fluid ending up in the tissues and getting lost from the blood, which can lead to, again, liver failure, kidney failure, and other issues like that. Albumins, again, most common type here, help maintain that blood volume, also act as transport proteins, where the globulins, these are some transport molecules as well. The alpha and betas are, where the gamma globulins are antibodies. And then finally, like I said, fibrinogen we'll talk about in more detail at the end of this chapter, but it makes up about 4% of those plasma proteins, and this is involved in the clotting process. If we spin down everything and get rid of these proteins, that's what with the clotting proteins removed, is what we call serum. And again, a lot of the rest of these are going to be a lot of your hormones and other stuff that are in there, some enzymes, and again, probably hundreds of these, of which we're not going to point any ones in particular out. I can then start showing you a lot of different things that are in plasma. So you can see a lot of nutrients. There's things that the body would take in from the digestive tract. So lipids, cholesterols, phospholipids, all these things that would be part of our diet or part of what our cells are, these need to be in there at some level. We see iron in the bloodstream. We see different vitamins, electrolytes. And again, this is getting into, and again, as you look at a lot of these ones, outside of the main plasma proteins, I'm more concerned that you understand that there's going to be electrolytes, vitamins, other nutrients, there's going to be waste products. I don't want you to worry about figuring out how much per liter on any of this, but electrolytes are important in maintaining blood volume, calcium important in nerve impulse conduction, heart contraction. We know sodium and potassium are important in normal cell function, especially muscle and nervous tissue with those sodium potassium pumps. So we're going to see electrolytes at a lot of different levels in there. Again, it's because anything that needs to get into or out of the cell, we have to see in the blood at some level. So we're going to see electrolytes in there. We're going to see waste products. Cells generate waste. The only way to get rid of that waste is to get it into the bloodstream and then get it into the kidneys, where we can then excrete it into the urine and get it out of the body. The other thing we see in there is going to be a lot of different respiratory gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, which we know are important. We will also see a lot of nitrogen in there, just not something we worry about too much, but that is also going to be in the plasma. Again, anything that needs to get in or out of the cell, we need to see in the plasma at some level. And again, if we spin this plasma down a little bit more, we can get the clotting proteins to fall out, and what's left there is going to be serum. A lot of times if there's somebody gets a particular disease and they know somebody else has had it, they can use actual serum, convalescent serum. They were doing this with COVID at some cases here before we got the vaccines going. Somebody that's had it, purify the antibodies out in that serum, give that serum to somebody else who has it, and it can help neutralize that particular infection. So what we'll be moving on from here then is we'll start taking a look at these different formed elements and what each of those are doing. Like I said, red blood cells, we're going to take a little while on these ones. There's a lot going on there in terms of the regulation of how they're made, as well as a lot about the blood types, because that is a function of the red blood cells. We'll spend a lot of time on that. Then we'll do leukocytes, thrombocytes, and then finally talk a little bit about how we stop blood loss when we have a break in a blood vessel. So I will see you next time.